Hey there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome back to part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 9, Sustaining Biodiversity, Saving Species, and Ecosystem Services. So we left off in part 1. We had that big picture of that Burmese python. We were talking about invasive species. And so now we're going to continue our discussion on those invasive species, specifically starting part 2 of the lecture on how do we control invasive species that may have been introduced either accidentally or deliberately into another environment. So research programs are around to identify who the invaders are. We can track invasive species with ground surveys and satellite observations nowadays, so that definitely does help. Establish international treaties banning the transfer between countries, and in a couple of slides we are going to start talking about some of the treaties and the conventions that have been put forth to try to help not only control invasive species but to sustain the Earth's biodiversity, and of course public education about releasing exotic pets and plants out there into the environment. Right? Some people maybe don't know that if you put a basically put a let a python go in the Everglades, that it could be an issue. A lot of people think, hey, that's kind of where naturally, it's out in the wild doing its thing. They don't really understand that it's an invasive species and how that can destroy an ecosystem. So again, public education always a plus when it comes to that. So what can you do to control invasive species? Well, do not buy wild plants or animals or remove them from natural areas. Do not release wild pets into natural areas. Do not dump aquarium contents or unused fishing bait into waterways or storm drains. When camping, only use local firewood. You see this sometimes if you drive around upstate. It says you're not allowed to import firewood. Before I started teaching this class, that kind of upset me. Why should I have to go buy local firewood? I used to throw firewood in my, because I got my own wood. I harvest my own wood in my backyard for my fireplace. I would throw the logs in my trunk and we'd go camping. Well, unfortunately, even if I'm going up to the Adirondacks or somewhere in New York, I could be taking creatures or things that are living in that wood into another area that then could escape and become invasive species. So only use that local firewood, which now I only use. Brush or clean pet dogs, hiking boots, mountain bikes, canoes, boats, motors, fishing tackle, and other gear before entering or leaving wild areas. Again, just a way to make sure that you're not taking any little critter home with you. Again, prevention is the best way to reduce the threats from invasive species. All right, so moving on, we talk about population growth, high rates of resource use, pollution, and climate change. Again, these are issues that are affecting the biodiversity. So again, we're talking about how to sustain that biodiversity. So human population growth and rising resource use per person is degrading the wildlife habitat. And again, you're kind of noticing how a lot of the stuff we've talked about in previous chapters, we're still talking about, because again, all of this is linked in environmental science. So we're kind of saying the same thing, but that's okay because hopefully it's driving home that point. Pollution, all right? Bioaccumulation occurs in individual organisms. We have biomagnification that occurs when a chemical becomes more concentrated as it moves up through food chains and webs. So we did talk about this a little bit in a previous chapter. We're going to talk about it again now, okay? That pollution that gets accumulated over time. And of course, climate change, right? Will accelerate the sixth extinction. We're talking about that right now. A major loss of diversity and ecosystem services because of that climate change. So this talks about something called DDT. Okay, this was DDT is basically a fat-soluble chemical that can accumulate in the fatty tissue of animals. It was used as a pesticide. It's not used anymore because we saw the effects of it. So basically, DDT in water. This is your bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Again, we talked about this in a couple of chapters ago when we talked about food webs and trophic levels. But as you have, as trophic levels increase, you biomagnify the amount of chemical or pollution that could be present in an organism. So you'll notice in water, DDT is only 3 parts per trillion, right? In zooplankton, it becomes 0.04 parts per million. Then by the time we get up to small fish, the DDT, 0.5 parts per million. By the time you get to large fish, 2 parts per million. And by the time you get to that fish-eating bird, 25 parts per million. So the accumulation or the magnification. So the accumulation is what happens in an individual organism, and then the biomagnification is what happens as you go to higher and higher trophic levels. You end up magnifying the amount of pollution, and this is a major issue. So this is why, for instance, my kids love to eat sushi. I got a son and daughter who will eat sushi every night of the week, but we can't because of the potential mercury content. You may have heard about that, especially in especially in salmon, right? Because again, by the time you get to a higher trophic level, like a salmon, which is a larger fish, right? Look at how that in DDT, same thing with mercury, you end up increasing because of biomagnification, the amount of pollution in the organism, in the tissues of that organism, and then you ingest that or we ingest that, and it's even magnified even more, all right? So that's why I don't allow my kids to eat sushi every day. Once a week or so, once every other week is about as much as I will allow them to do. All right, so we now move on to talking about the illegal killing, capturing, and selling of wild species. So again, when we talk about sustaining biodiversity, we talk about invasive species, we talk about pollution and resource use, but we also talk about how humans are themselves affecting, with not necessarily through pollution, but with actually killing, capturing, and selling these wild species, which unfortunately is leading to many of them becoming endangered. So you remember way back in the 1800s, we had coastal communities in Asia, for instance, who hunted whale. Europeans and Americans did it as well. Hunted whales almost to extinction because of the whale oil, right, that were used to light kerosene lamps and things like that back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We've since stopped that because we realized that we were endangering and killing off all our whales. But it's still happening with other creatures. So poaching and smuggling of protected animals is a huge issue. Organized crime is actually involved because of the huge profits that they can make. Elephants and rhinos especially are killed for their tusks and their horns. That's it. They don't know when he even eats the meat, right? In the olden days, when hunter-gatherers would kill an elephant, they would maybe take the horns, but they would also use the entire animal, right? They would use it for food. They would use it for clothing. Now, people are just killing them and taking their tusks, leaving everything else, which is killing our biodiversity, making these creatures potentially endangered and potentially extinct. Tigers are poached for their skin and other body parts. Pet trade, right? Exotic birds, amphibians, reptiles, tropical fish. All issues that could reduce the biodiversity on the planet. Here's a tough picture to look at, but we have to look at it. All right, we have to see what's going on here, guys. All right, this is in South Africa. Obviously, this is a poacher. This isn't a poacher. This is the critically endangered white rhinoceros. Okay, but a poacher killed this rhinoceros just for its horns. It took off the two horns and left the dead rhinoceros there. Okay, and this is what is happening a lot in parts of the world. We have these poachers because, again, those horns are worth a lot of money. So people kill the animal, take the horns, and now, unfortunately, the white rhinoceros is a critically endangered species. In addition, we're getting a disturbing message from our birds, okay? So that's a case study that we're going to look at here as well. 70% of the world's bird species are declining. 1 of 8 bird species are threatened with extinction, mostly in our tropical forests, right? We talked about how our tropical forests have the greatest amount of biodiversity on the planet. Well, most of our birds that are threatened with extinction are coming from those tropical forests. So what are causes? Habitat loss and degradation, right? Migrating birds. You migrate to another habitat. That habitat isn't there anymore. That messes up your migration, messes up your breeding, and that unfortunately leads to lower birth rates and could be a cause for extinction. Invasive species obviously affecting birds, and climate change as well, which of course affects their migratory and breeding patterns as well. More issues with birds. Exposure to pesticides are killing them off. Overexploitation, right? Parrots are threatened due to the sale as pets. We talked about that in part 1 of this lecture about the parrots. Birds are good indicator species. We talked about what's an indicator species? A species that tells us or indicates kind of first and foremost when there's an issue in the environment. We spoke about how amphibians in a previous unit are good indicator species. Well, birds are another very good indicator species because they respond quickly to environmental change. So if we see birds dying off, we know there is something wrong in the environment. Birds also perform critical ecosystem and economic services for us. So extinctions of birds could affect many other species. All right, back to humans and how they are affecting. So we talked about how humans can illegally kill, poach animals. There's also a rising demand for bushmeat that threatens some African species. What is bushmeat? Bushmeat is meat that comes from the bush, or basically from the wild African areas, the plains, the savannas, things like that. So the hunting bushmeat is a source of food also in West and Central Africa. So here's another issue that we talk about, that moral issue, right? So you have a community that kills bushmeat for food. They want to feed their children, right? So how can you tell them you're not allowed to eat this bushmeat from this endangered species? So again, here's where the immorality of this comes into play. Hunting wildlife has skyrocketed within the past 3 decades. One species of red colobus monkey has already become extinct, and we're seeing reduced populations of orangutans. We spoke about that, right, in part 1 of this lecture on chapter 9, gorillas, chimpanzees, elephants, and hippos. USAID introducing methods for breeding alternatives, sources of protein to villages. So basically, if we can tell the villagers, hey, yes, that bushmeat is a great source of protein, but here are some other alternatives to get that protein. Again, this is just education that hopefully those villagers in West and Central Africa, instead of killing the endangered species for meat, will maybe use some of these alternative breeding methods to get that source of protein. And again, that's more of that education that we spoke about in a couple of slides. So once again, tough slide to look at, but I think we need to do it. This is the severed head of the endangered lowland gorilla in the Congo. Again, what happened here is these villagers killed the gorilla and ate the gorilla, right? Because it's a great source of meat and protein for the villagers. But unfortunately, it is a endangered animal. So again, we need to educate those folks, and we need to provide them with alternatives to feed their families. Because again, how do you tell someone you can't feed your family? But we can give you alternatives that maybe can stop them from killing the endangered species for bushmeat, and maybe can use some of those alternative breeding methods. All right, so moving on, how can we sustain wild species and the ecosystem services they provide? So, ways to reduce species extinction and sustain ecosystem services. We need to establish and enforce national environmental laws and international treaties, and create protected wildlife sanctuaries where these creatures can live and prosper and don't have to worry about human beings kind of messing with their environment. So here are some treaties and laws that can help protect species. I would memorize these guys, okay? So these are going to be important. You are going to have to know these treaties, not only for my test potentially, but also for the big test come spring. So 1975, we had the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, excuse me, not Florida, flora, and its acronym is CITES, okay? So that's what you kind of want to know. Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, signed by 181 countries back in 1975. We also have the Convention on Biological Diversity, BCD, which commits governments to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss, ratified by 196 countries, unfortunately not by us, but this law lacks enforcement mechanisms, okay? So the 1975, the CITES law, that convention is used a lot more. Again, the BCD, we didn't ratify it here in the U.S., and it does lack some of those enforcement measures. Then we have the Endangered Species Act, ESA of 1973, and it has been amended several times. The Endangered Species Act identifies and protects endangered species in the U.S. and abroad. It creates a recovery program for those listed species. The National Marine Fisheries Services is what handles ocean species, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service handle all others. What does that mean? The National Marine Fisheries Service is responsible for enforcing the Endangered Species Act for ocean species, while the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are in charge of enforcing the Endangered Species Act for all other types of species. All right, so know that one as well. The ESA, established in 1973 and amended several times. The ESA also forbids federal agencies, except the Department of Defense, from funding projects that jeopardize endangered or threatened species. It requires commercial shipments of wildlife that come through certain ports. Again, this is all the U.S. Endangered Species Act. In 2005, 1,591 species were officially listed on the endangered species list. 90% of the Endangered Species Act protected species are recovering at a projected rate. Let's all give a round of applause here, okay? Because again, we talk about all the negatives in environmental science, but here is a positive. The Endangered Species Act of 1973, and again, amended several times, is now working. 90% of the species protected by that act are recovering at some projected rate. So that's good news, and we need to see more of that. It just shows you that it does work. Okay, these acts, these treaties, these conventions do work if we have a way to monitor them and if we have a way to enforce them like we do with the U.S. Endangered Species Act. All right, so critical concept, environmental policy, how is it made? So again, we just spoke about some treaties and conventions, but how do you go about making them? This may be something you do, right? If you go into environmental science, and I hope many of you do, you may be involved in creating environmental policy. So here's how it works. Begins when citizens, that's you and me, interest groups or corporations seek solutions to issues. So a policy life cycle. You need to first identify the problem. You then, number two, research on the underlying science behind the problem. You then craft a policy solution. You then monitor how well it works, and then you adjust a policy as needed. We talked about how the Endangered Species Act was amended several times since 1973. That's because it was monitored, worked well in some areas, didn't work well in some areas, and so the policy was adjusted. Okay, so that's how it's made. All right, another way to protect species is to establish wildlife refuges and other protected areas where species can live naturally and keep that biodiversity. So in 1903, Teddy Roosevelt established the first federal wildlife refuge on Pelican Island in Florida. What is a wildlife refuge? Well, most of them are wetland sanctuaries. They provide habitats for 25% of U.S. threatened or endangered species. Harmful activities such as mining, drilling, and using off-road vehicles are actually legal in most refuges, but they're limited and they are controlled. Okay, so you're not going to get as much of them as you would. So here is Pelican Island. Again, this was the first national refuge that was created in the United States, and there it is in all its glory. All right, another way that we can try to preserve our biodiversity is through seed banks, botanical gardens, and wildlife farms. So what's a seed bank? A seed bank preserves genetic material of endangered plants, and there's actually one up in the Arctic, believe it or not, where they're actually keeping the seeds of all, they're trying to at least, all the plants that we have on the planet. They're trying to get them, classify them, and put their seeds in this seed bank up in the Arctic to protect them just in case they happen to go extinct. Botanical gardens and arboretas, that's for trees, right? That's where living plants can go. Farms also can raise organisms for commercial sale. Zoos and aquariums are also another way to try to preserve endangered terrestrial species. So what techniques do they use? Well, they use egg pulling, captive breeding, artificial insemination, embryo transfer, use of incubators, and cross-fostering to try to breed and try to raise endangered species. Okay, so we try to, a lot of those endangered species we talked about are case selected and therefore have a hard time reproducing. So these steps here basically help organisms reproduce basically by doing these things, and that's a technique that helps preserve those endangered species, with the ultimate goal of the captive breeding program is eventually to release and reintroduce the populations into the wild. So the idea is not to raise them in captivity and keep them in captivity. The idea is to raise these endangered species to an age where they can then live on their own and then release them back into the wild. Captive population must number 100 to 500 individuals. Public aquariums also provide education, not effective gene banks due to limited funds, but they do provide education. So here is this is the Monterey Bay Aquarium in Monterey, California. It actually has a tidewater pool there that you're looking at, where they actually rescue sea otter pups to survive in the wild, right? So they rescue the sea island pups when they're very, very young. They then raise them in the aquarium, and then they train the sea otter pups how to be a sea otter, right, in that tide pool, and then eventually release them back into the wild with the hope that they will survive and then increase the population of sea otters, again, making them not endangered or not threatened. So that is the goal. And as with always, it's the precautionary principle. Okay, so we're going to finish up talking about this. What is the precautionary principle? We spoke about it in a little bit, I believe, in a previous chapter. Again, when it comes to sustaining biodiversity, we want to follow this principle. It acts to prevent or reduce harm when preliminary evidence indicates acting is needed. Good strategy in other areas. It prevents exposure to harmful chemicals in our air, water, and food. Emphasis on preventing species extinction. Act early rather than when species are nearly extinct. So what it's saying is that precautionary. Act to prevent or reduce harm when only the preliminary evidence indicates acting is needed. Usually, unfortunately, as human beings, we wait until there is a fire and then we put the fire out, right? Well, the precautionary principle says, don't wait until there's a fire. If you think a fire might happen, well, put it out initially. And that's what it's saying. So in this case, the fire is obviously the reduction of biodiversity on the planet. So if you notice something is happening, if it looks like a creature may be starting to become threatened or extinct, don't wait until it's threatened or endangered or ends up on the endangered species list, right? Don't wait till it gets there. Deal with it initially. And therefore, if you deal with it initially, you can mitigate the problems. And this is the precautionary principle. So, protecting species and ecosystem services do raise some difficult questions. We've talked about these difficult questions throughout this course. Should we focus on protecting species or ecosystems and services they provide? How do we decide which species get attention, right? Protecting species appealing to humans can increase public awareness of the need, but then what about other creatures that maybe we don't find as cute or as cuddly, right? We don't care about them. How do we decide which species get our attention? How do we determine which habitat areas to protect? And how do we allocate our resources for that? Okay, these are all questions that bring in the morality of environmental science into play. So, what can you do to protect species? Do not buy furs, ivory products, or other items made from endangered or threatened animal species. Do not buy wood or wood products from tropical or old-growth forests. Do not buy pet animals or pets or plants taken from the wild, and tell friends and relatives what you are doing about this problem, because again, education is always the key when we try to solve these difficult issues. All right. Well, that concludes my lecture on Chapter 9, Sustaining Biodiversity, Saving Species and Ecosystem Services. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, thanks for listening.